This innocuous little twig right here actually represents a major source of frustration for me in the garden right now. See, every one of these little terminals or these little knuckles on this should have been a delicious tomato, but instead the flowers dropped off, never to return, seriously dampening the yields on the plants that I put so much work into. I love gardening for the sake of gardening. I love raising these plants for the sake of raising these plants. But ultimately, my goal with that big tomato garden we put in this year is to get lots of food. So this thing right here is a bummer, a major bummer. One I think we should get to the bottom of together. Today's video is all about the causes and cures of poor fruit set in tomato plants, sometimes called blossom drop, or basically what's going on with all of these little empty trusses like this one right here. And rather than wallow in the misery that is expecting to go out into your garden and finding it empty of delicious tomatoes, I thought it would be fun to play kind of detective together here and sort of go out and take a look at my plants and take a look at the garden and see if we can figure out together what changes we need to make. I think to start today's investigation, let's go ahead and ask some questions, take some notes, get a lay of the land, and then we'll go from there. If you are dealing with blossom drop or poor fruit set yourself at home, maybe follow along and we can do this together. Okay, so question number one, is the blossom drop issue, is the fruit set issue affecting your entire tomato garden, or certain areas, certain locations within that garden more affected than others? Take our little backyard toddler garden, our little container garden back here, for instance. The plants back here actually dried out pretty badly while we were gone. We had to do some really excessive pruning, but fruit set hasn't been too bad. Definitely not 100%, but pretty far from 0% as well. Whereas in our in-ground garden in the front, we are definitely seeing much worse fruit set. There are locations though, particularly around like sort of the back edges and sort of the backside where the plants receive less sunlight, that are doing a little bit better than areas that are receiving more sunlight. So a second good question to ask yourself is, are there differences by variety? So for instance, in our garden, overall, the cherry tomatoes are doing the best. And then within the cherry tomato grouping or classification, whatever you want to call it, the yellow pear cherry tomatoes, yes, they are still actually technically cherry tomatoes, they're doing the best of the best. And then after that, we have our paste tomatoes. We're growing San Marzano specifically. They're doing pretty well, certainly not 100%, but I'm not overly worried about the yield on those. They're definitely still setting fruit. After that, we have our smaller slicer tomatoes. So for us, that's the Black Prince variety. They're doing okay, maybe somewhere around 50%, between 50 and 75%, depending on the plant, pollination rate, fruit set rate. And after that, we have our larger slicer tomatoes. We're not growing anything gargantuan. We're not growing mortgage lifters or anything. That we've got Dr. Thorburn's terracotta, and we've got Paul Robeson. Those are our larger slicer varieties. And those are doing pretty poor. In some cases, we've got empty trusses and between 10 and 20%. It seems like it's pretty normal, particularly with the trusses that flowered while we were gone. So pretty disappointing on those. Another good question we can ask ourselves is, what was the weather like when these trusses were flowering? For us, a lot of these flowers or a lot of these trusses that are experiencing really poor fruit set were flowering right as spring turned into summer, and that period was sort of capped off by this just absolutely brutal heat wave. Temperatures got up to about 105, so just over 40 degrees Celsius, and we're regularly in the upper 90s up until that point, and we were experiencing very low relative humidity as well. And then at this point in our season, we start to see the wind really die down and kind of get a little bit still following some pretty big windstorms. So it went from cool and very windy and very moderate to very hot, very still, very low humidity very quickly. Another interesting question to ask yourself is, if you have them, how are the other nightshades in your garden doing relative to your tomatoes? Are they setting fruit better or worse than the tomatoes? We've been harvesting our green tomatillos, our corbaci peppers, our Hungarian wax peppers, our Corno di Toro peppers, all of it for weeks. We've been making tons of salsa. They're doing really, really well, and that's why some of these plants are looking a little bit empty. We've just been harvesting and eating them. They're setting fruit just fine. But on the other hand, the eggplants were setting fruit really poorly. We were seeing almost a 0% pollination rate. All the flowers were dropping off until something we changed really recently that resulted in all these little beauties that you're seeing right here. I'll go over that in a minute. Hey, if you think this video might help you get more tomatoes this year, please consider liking it or even subscribing to the channel. It just really helps me out. I super appreciate appreciate it. All right, thanks so much. Let's get back into the pollination talk. Next question, are the plants exhibiting any other signs of stress other than flower drop that can help you understand what is going on in their environment? Last week in a video about blossom end rot, I talked a little bit about how I felt like my watering was a little underpowered, how my soil was getting too dry between waterings. There's also some pretty obvious scalding going on some of the leaves, so definitely there is some water stress and some heat stress going on here. Final question, was I doing anything different as a garden during the period that the plants were not doing a very good job of setting fruit? So for me, this was a period where I was physically not present. I wasn't perusing the garden, and I wasn't doing my usual little finger taps as I peruse the garden. See, what I normally do is when I see a tomato truss or a set of flowers that looks like it's ready to pollinate, like these ones are here, I just come by and give it a little tap, 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 tap for maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And that has always worked really, really well, like super well, like no problems whatsoever well. But obviously I wasn't here to do it this time, and that seems to have contributed to the problem. So what did we learn through all of this? Well, we've definitely got some discrepancies by variety, by location, by nightshade genus, and we've also got some obvious care and environmental factors going on as well. Let's go ahead and try and take that whole body of information and try and match it up against what we know about the known causes of tomato blossom drop or poor fruit set. We're pretty focused on tomatoes, but this is also a helpful exercise for any other nightshades you're experiencing problems with as well, like our eggplants, for instance. I'm gonna go through the common causes of poor fruit set from the ones that are least concerning to me to the most likely culprits in my garden. Tomatoes and other nightshades need plenty of potassium available to flower and set fruit, and will do so much more readily if there's not an overabundant supply of nitrogen in the soil. If you are seeing just an overabundance of giant plants with tons of foliage and very little fruit, and you want to just make sure that your fertilization strategy is on point, I have a much more in-depth video on that specifically that I will link to in the description. Some tomato varieties are just better able to withstand environmental stressors and still set fruit. There are actually a number of really cool modern hybrids that I'm interested in looking into that are specifically bred to set fruit in high heat. So I'll link to an article with a really good list, but Solar Fire seems to be one popular option for a modern hybrid determinate plant. And then if you're interested in more sort of the heirloom indeterminate varieties, that good old yellow pear cherry tomato sets fruit pretty well even under high heat. If you're interested in finding more varieties like that, try the keyword heat set or heat tolerant to find a bunch more. And of course, there are also plants that were specifically bred to set fruit in cooler temperatures, largely plants that were bred in more northern climates. If I get to the point where I feel like it is just a choice between growing what is fun and interesting and actually growing a lot of food to eat, well, you better believe that I'm going to change it up and start growing some of those modern hybrids. We'll just see where the season takes us. So I'm pretty sure that I have been underwatering my tomato plants for a little while here, specifically these container tomatoes, and specifically while we were gone and relying on some last minute automated irrigation. So we've taken steps to adjust because in addition to causing blossom end rot, poor watering schedules, not enough moisture in that soil can lead to poor fruit set. So personally, I think that dialing in your watering strategy is mostly a matter of starting with a reasonable baseline and then paying attention to the actual health of the soil, the health of the plant, and trying to make a determination of which way to go. Like a lot of environmental stressors, both too much and too little water can exacerbate the issue of poor fruit set or blossom drop. So it's kind of incumbent upon us to physically come in here and pull back the mulch, whether that's in a container or in the ground, put our fingers into the soil and make a determination, hey, is this too much or is this too little, and adjusting from there. There are only 3 tricks that I'm personally aware of to make watering correctly mid-season easier. The first would be to water deeply and slowly and consistently, but infrequently, rather than often and shallowly. The second would be to use generous amounts of mulch. I use wood chip mulch, obviously, but whatever your preference is, to help prevent excessive evaporation between those waterings. And then the third is you can actually invest in a soil moisture meter if you're just having a really hard time making a determination whether or not you're giving too much or too little water. So here's just the big frustrating reality. Tomato plants are going to drop their flowers as temperatures rise above 85 degrees Fahrenheit or just below 30 degrees Celsius during the day, or above 70 degrees or so during the night. Luckily, it's not a switch that flips all at once, right? You're not gonna see all of your tomato crop fail immediately as temperatures hit 85 degrees, or probably none of us would ever get much of a crop at all, but it is a progressive scale. So for instance, as you get up to about 104 degrees or around 40 degrees Celsius, you're going to start seeing those tomato flowers drop and fail and the pollen become non-viable after as little as 3 or 4 hours or prolonged multiple day stretches above that 85 degrees. At those really high temperatures, the pollen inside the flower becomes dry and non-viable, and the actual organs themselves held within that flower can fail to form correctly. This is hard for me to imagine, but also it's the same deal with really cool nighttime temperatures. Below 55 degrees, the actual pollen tubes in those tomato flowers can fail to form correctly. And on a very similar related note, the actual pollen within the flower is most likely to be viable and successfully reach the female organ, that stigma, within that same flower when relative humidity is between 40% and about 70%. I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of a tricky one. In fact, I sort of feel like if we weren't talking about tomatoes, the gold standard of summer vegetable gardens, but a different crop that people were maybe a little bit less excited about, we'd probably just to give in and say, hey, my climate's really not appropriate for this plant, and we would try to grow something else that is more appropriate. But we are talking about tomatoes, and capitulation to the weather is not an option.
Excuse the interruption, I had to just chase some chickens out of my front yard garden. I live in the suburbs. I guess life will find a way.
Let's talk about some tactics for dealing with extreme heat and extreme humidity levels. An easy one is to try and get out there and shake your little tomato flowers when conditions are perhaps more appropriate or more conducive to pollination. So this isn't going to solve for pollen that has gone bad, that is no longer viable, but it helps a little bit at the margins. So for instance here, it's quite a bit cooler and a little bit moister, a little bit more humid in the morning. So I'm gonna try and get out there early in the morning before that afternoon heat is really set in. Another thing you can try is moving up your transplant day. So for instance, if you know that midsummer is going to be absolutely brutal and really interfere with your harvest, you can try to pair an earlier seed starting date, an earlier transplant date with a variety that is bred specifically for more northern climates that's going to mature and set harvest earlier, and that way it can deal with those cooler spring temperatures and get you some tomatoes before that really strong sun starts hitting. We can also try pruning for larger canopies. This plant we're kind of actually just leaving to do its own thing. We barely prune it at all. Or you can have multiple leaders going rather than just one sucker or one leader going up a single stem. You can leave a couple in place, and that way you're gonna have a larger canopy, more foliage in place, and that'll do a little bit to help shade out the plant, keep that stem a little bit cooler and less stressed out. A more surefire but expensive way to achieve that exact same effect would be to install some gardeners or greenhouse shade cloths, say at about 30%. Unfortunately, that stuff has really gone up in price over the last year. It's like doubled in my experience, so I haven't installed any yet, even though I was thinking about it. But if I continue to have problems with fruit set, I might just do it. It's super popular in my climate for a reason. Finally, you can always try and just wait out that heat and keep the plants as healthy as possible so that you get a better harvest in the back half of the season as things start to cool off. And I'm going to use this time to take detailed notes about sort of the specific layout of my garden. I know that for me, spots that I thought were going to be the absolute best pinnacle for tomatoes are really underperforming, whereas there were some spots where I thought, hey, this is basically a throwaway, but might as well, I've got extra plants, I'll plant something here, are doing really, really well. So go ahead and take detailed notes and make some changes for next year. The downside to that strategy is that we're starting to reach the time of the season where disease and pest pressure kind of becomes this ticking time bomb in our gardens. So that strategy of waiting is really only going to work, and it's only really viable if you don't struggle too much with those issues. And if you know that you don't struggle too much with those issues, you've done it in the same spot before. If you do, and that's not sounding like a great idea, well, I think shade cloth is probably your best option. Now, I'm pretty confident that high heat and low humidity are at least partially to blame for some of our blossom drop woes, but I don't think they're the whole story or even potentially the lion's share. See, we've been harvesting from our peppers like crazy. They're setting fruit really, really well. And everything that I said about a tomato flower's non-viability at extreme temperatures, well, that holds true for peppers too. And when we were seeing absolutely horrible fruit set rates on our eggplants early in the season, like 0% fruit set rate, adding this little beauty into our arsenal has resulted in tons and tons of beautiful little baby eggplants that we're just about to harvest now, which is why I think an even bigger issue than heat and humidity was this $5 electric toothbrush is basically my portable bumblebee. See, a big beautiful bumblebee is perfectly capable of shaking pollen off and onto the correct spot, onto the stigma on a tomato flower, and that's all a tomato flower needs because it produces complete or perfect flowers with both the male and female organs present in one flower. Unfortunately, tomatoes don't produce flowers that are particularly attractive to pollinator insects like bumblebees. We've got a nice mix of zinnias and marigolds and sunflowers and Johnny jump ups and herbs that we've let go to flower just to attract the pollinator insects, and still we see relatively little pollinator insect activity on the tomato flower specifically. It seems like they would much rather make a beeline for either all those flowers I just mentioned or for other nightshade plants that produce larger flowers with heavier pollen, our tomatillos and our eggplants and our lychee tomatoes. We just don't see them going on to the actual tomato flowers all that often, which means that wind is the more important contributor to tomato fruit set or tomato pollination, but that doesn't help us very much because our weather has been rather still. So for us and most folks watching this, I imagine, insect pollination and wind pollination just isn't going to cut it. It's really critical that we get out there and actually manually pollinate those tomato flowers to improve the size of our yield. Now, I have always just used the good old finger tap method where I get out there and just gently try and vibrate the base of the tomato truss or the actual flower itself for 5 to 10 seconds, and that's always worked really well, but I've had to upgrade this year to this electric toothbrush. Maybe you're like me and you've always dismissed the whole electric toothbrush pollination thing as a bit of a silly gimmick. After all, I haven't seen any controlled studies showing its efficacy, and in a smaller garden, I certainly never needed it. Just the finger tapping was more than enough. But I tell you what, I could not have been more wrong because a little electric toothbrush like this one is basically just a cheaper version of a purpose-made electric pollinator that are commonly used to pollinate tomatoes grown in controlled greenhouses. You know what? I've got to say, it is just absolutely silly what a positive improvement this little thing has made. I so wish that I had bought one at the outset of the season, particularly for our tomatoes and eggplants. It has just made a world of difference. So don't be me, at least consider grabbing one if you are having pollination woes. Let me show you real quick how to use this little sucker to massively improve your pollination rates. Nothing to it. So great. Works perfect. And that is all I've got for you today. As always, happy gardening, y'all, and I will see you on the next one.